there is a strange object sitting in almost every kitchen on Earth. It can be torn apart with your hands, dipped into soup, wrapped around meat, toasted for breakfast, or transformed into a sandwich in seconds. And yet, thousands of years ago, making it required an astonishing amount of work. You had to find wild grasses, harvest their tiny seeds, remove their husks, crush them between stones, mix the powder with water, and somehow turn that paste into something edible. The remarkable part is not that humans eventually learned to make bread. It is that they started doing it before they had farms, and that raises a much bigger question. Why would people who were free to move across landscapes spend hours grinding wild grain just to make a flat piece of bread? The answer takes us back more than 14,000 years, before cities, before writing, before kings, and before civilization as we know it. And by the time we reach the modern supermarket, that simple food will have helped create agriculture, shaped economies, defined social classes, fed armies, inspired religious traditions, and brought ordinary people into the streets to challenge governments. This is the history of bread, and the story begins with something that barely looks like food. Around 14,000 years ago, in the region we now call the Leavened, people belonging to the Natufian culture were gathering wild grasses. There were no wheat fields stretching toward the horizon. No tractors, no organized farms, no bakeries. The plants growing around them were wild ancestors of the grains we know today. Their seeds were small, hard, and protected by husks. Eating them directly was difficult and inefficient, but humans had already discovered a remarkable trick: stone. By placing grain between stones and grinding it, they could break the seeds down into something their bodies could use more easily. At first, this did not necessarily produce bread. The ground grain could have been eaten as a paste or cooked into something resembling porridge, but eventually someone discovered another possibility. Add water, form the mixture into a rough dough. Then place it against a hot stone or near a fire. The result was something entirely different. A flat, cooked food that was portable, relatively durable, and packed with energy. It was bread. And this discovery may have happened much earlier than the invention of agriculture. Archaeologists working at Shubayqa 1 in northeastern Jordan discovered charred fragments of ancient flatbread dating to roughly 14,400 years ago. That date matters because agriculture was still centuries away. The people who made this bread were hunter-gatherers. They were not farmers waiting for their crops to grow. They were collecting wild plants from the landscape around them. The discovery changed one of the oldest assumptions about the history of bread. For a long time, the obvious story seemed simple. Humans invented farming. Farming produced grain. Grain produced flour. And flour produced bread. But archaeology has complicated that sequence. Bread was already here. And if people were willing to invest so much labor into making it, perhaps the desire for grain-based foods helped encourage the transition toward agriculture itself. We should be careful here. Bread did not single-handedly cause the agricultural revolution. Human settlement, climate change, population pressure, changing environments, storage, domestication, and social organization all played roles. But the relationship between bread and farming is far more complicated than the simple story many of us learned. The first bread makers were solving a practical problem. Wild grain was difficult to eat. Bread turned it into portable energy. A handful of seeds could become something that could be carried, shared, stored, and eaten later. That was a powerful advantage for people whose lives depended on finding food across changing landscapes. But bread had a price, and the price was labor. Grinding grain was exhausting. Archaeologists examining ancient skeletons have found physical wear consistent with repetitive grinding and other demanding tasks. Ancient teeth also reveal something about the consequences of early grain processing. The stones used to grind grain could leave tiny particles behind. Those particles ended up in flour. And over years of eating it, they could contribute to severe tooth wear. So bread was not an effortless miracle. It was a technology that demanded time, tools, fire, and human bodies. Yet people kept making it. That tells us something. Bread must have been worth the trouble, and perhaps the greatest clue is hidden in what happened next. Humans began staying closer to the places where useful grains grew. Wild plants became increasingly important. People began managing landscapes. Eventually, some communities started deliberately planting and harvesting crops. Over generations, humans changed the plants themselves. Wild grasses have a problem from a farmer's perspective. When their seeds mature, many wild grasses naturally release them. That is excellent for reproduction. It is terrible for harvesting. But humans repeatedly selected plants whose seeds were easier to collect. Seeds stayed attached to the stalk. Those plants were gathered and replanted. Generation after generation, the relationship changed. The plant was no longer simply something humans found. It became something humans depended upon. Wheat was becoming a crop. And with the crop came permanent settlements. Once grain could be cultivated and stored, people had a reason to remain in one place. Once people remained in one place, populations could grow. Once populations grew, food had to be organized. Who planted it? Who harvested it? Who stored it? Who protected it? Who distributed it? The history of bread was becoming the history of organization itself. And nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than along the Nile. Ancient Egypt became one of the great bread civilizations. Grain was not merely an ingredient. It was part of the economic foundation of society. Bread appeared in religious offerings, tombs, artwork, writing, and everyday life. The Egyptians developed many forms of bread, using different grains and adding ingredients such as dates, honey, and other flavorings. But something even more important happened in Egypt. Bread learned to rise. Flatbread had been possible for thousands of years, but leavened bread was different. Somewhere in the ancient world, probably through repeated exposure to fermentation, people discovered that dough left sitting for a while could change. Wild microorganisms interacted with the mixture. Yeast consumed available sugars and released carbon dioxide. That gas became trapped within the developing dough. The dough expanded. Then the heat of the oven transformed it into something lighter and softer. Humans had discovered fermentation. The precise moment cannot be identified. There was no ancient baker standing beside the first risen loaf with a notebook. The popular story that someone simply left dough out by accident is possible, but it is not something historians can prove. What we do know is that ancient Egyptians became highly skilled at controlling fermentation. They learned that a portion of fermented dough could help start the next batch. That idea is the ancestor of the sourdough starter still used by bakers today. Bread had become more than a survival food. It had become a craft, and then it became something even more powerful. A form of payment. Workers in ancient Egypt could receive food rations that included bread and beer. The famous workers' settlement, associated with the construction of the Giza pyramids, provides evidence of organized food distribution on a large scale. This does not mean that bread was literally a universal currency in the modern sense, but it demonstrates something crucial. A society could organize labor around controlled supplies of grain, bread, and beer. The people who built monuments were not simply fed randomly. Food was part of an administrative system. And once food becomes something an institution must reliably provide, it becomes political. That lesson would become even more important in Rome. The Roman Empire, eventually created one of the largest and most sophisticated grain supply systems of the ancient world. Rome was enormous. Its population could not be sustained by the farms immediately surrounding the city, so grain had to travel. Ships carried wheat across the Mediterranean. Much of it came from provinces in North Africa and Egypt. The grain arrived at ports, moved through warehouses, traveled along rivers and roads, entered mills, and eventually became flour and bread. It was an ancient supply chain, and it had a vulnerability. If the grain stopped, Rome had a problem. A delayed shipment could send prices upward. A failed harvest could create panic. A disruption in North Africa could affect people living hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. Roman politicians understood the danger. They also understood the opportunity. Food could buy loyalty. The Roman grain dole, known as the Annona, became a major instrument of state policy. Large numbers of citizens received subsidized or free grain. Later, the system expanded to include bread. The principle was simple: keep the population fed, and political stability becomes easier. Allow food to become scarce or unaffordable, and stability becomes fragile. Bread had crossed another invisible boundary. It was no longer just something people ate. It was something governments had to manage. But bread could also expose the weaknesses of governments. When supply chains failed, people knew exactly who to blame. And when Rome's control over its grain-producing territories weakened, the consequences were severe. The Western Roman Empire did not collapse because of bread alone. That would be an absurd simplification. Military pressure, political instability, economic problems, internal conflicts, and external invasions all mattered. But the story of Rome demonstrates an enduring principle. Large cities require enormous quantities of food, and the larger the city becomes, the more dependent it becomes on systems that most citizens never see. The bakery hides the supply chain. The loaf hides the field, and the field hides the political system that keeps the food moving. After Rome, bread took on another meaning in medieval Europe. It became a visible marker of social class. The wealthy could afford finely sifted wheat flour. The poor relied more heavily on rye, barley, oats, mixed grains, and whatever ingredients were available. The color and texture of bread could tell you something about the person eating it. White bread was associated with status. Dark bread was associated with necessity. That distinction seems strange today because modern supermarkets can put dozens of varieties on the same shelf. But for centuries, bread was one of the clearest indicators of inequality. And governments knew that bread was too important to leave entirely to chance. Medieval towns developed regulations governing bakers, prices, weights, and quality. England's assize of bread became one of the most famous examples. The principle behind such laws was straightforward. If a baker could secretly reduce the weight of a loaf while charging the same price, customers would lose. If flour became more expensive, the price and size of bread became political questions. And if bread became too expensive, ordinary people could become angry very quickly. This created a strange relationship between the baker and the state. The baker was a business owner. But the baker was also part of the food infrastructure of the city. Bread fraud was not treated like an ordinary commercial dispute. It could be treated as a threat to public welfare. Because when the product is essential, cheating has consequences far beyond the shop. Then came another transformation. For thousands of years, bread was local. Grain was grown near communities. It was milled relatively close to where it was consumed. Bakers worked with local supplies. The Industrial Revolution began changing that. Machines became more powerful. Transportation became faster. Mills became larger, and one technology in particular transformed flour: the roller mill. Instead of relying only on traditional stone grinding, industrial milling could process wheat on a much larger scale and separate different parts of the grain more efficiently. The result was an explosion in the availability of refined white flour. That created a remarkable reversal. For centuries, white bread had been associated with wealth. Now industrial technology could make it available to ordinary consumers. White bread became cheaper, it became softer, it lasted longer, and it became a symbol of modern industrial food. But the transformation came with a trade-off. The grain contains more than the white endosperm. The bran and germ contain fiber and nutrients. Refining removes much of that material. In the early 20th century, nutritional deficiencies associated with heavily refined diets became a major public health concern in some populations. Governments eventually introduced flour enrichment policies in various countries, adding back specific nutrients that milling had removed. It was an extraordinary example of industrial food technology, creating a problem that another technology then had to solve. And bread was about to become even more industrial. In the 20th century, the goal was no longer simply to make bread. It was to make bread faster, cheaper, more consistently, and in enormous quantities. In 1928, commercially sliced bread appeared in the United States using Otto Roeder's slicing machine. It changed the way people interacted with the loaf. Instead of cutting each portion manually, the bread arrived already divided into uniform slices. Convenience had become part of the product. Then, in the 1960s, the Chorleywood bread process transformed commercial baking in Britain and beyond. The process used intensive mechanical mixing and other techniques to accelerate production. Traditional fermentation could take many hours. Industrial methods could dramatically shorten the timeline. Bread could now be manufactured at a scale that ancient bakers could never have imagined. This was a triumph of efficiency, but it also created a new question. What happens when a food that once depended on time becomes a product designed to eliminate time? Traditional bread making often relied on slow fermentation. Industrial bread increasingly emphasized speed, consistency, softness, shelf life, and cost. The modern supermarket loaf is the result of an extraordinary chain of technological changes. The grain was bred, the mill was mechanized, the flour was refined, the dough was engineered. The fermentation was accelerated, the loaf was sliced, the packaging was optimized, and the distribution network expanded across entire countries and eventually continents. The bread sitting on a supermarket shelf may look simple. Its history is anything but. And yet, despite all these technological changes, one thing never disappeared. Bread remained political. We can see that most clearly in France. By the late 18th century, bread had become a central part of the economic crisis facing ordinary French families. Poor harvests pushed grain prices upward. The cost of bread became an enormous burden on working households. And when people are spending an extraordinary share of their income simply to obtain food, political arguments become very different. A declaration about liberty is abstract when your family is hungry. The price of a loaf is not. In 1789, thousands of women marched from Paris toward Versailles. Their grievances were complex. They were angry about food shortages, prices, political conditions, and the behavior of the monarchy. But bread was at the center of the crisis. The march helped force the royal family back toward Paris. The French Revolution had many causes. It was not caused by bread alone. But bread turned economic hardship into something immediate and physical. And that is why one of the most famous myths of the entire period became attached to Marie Antoinette. The story says she responded to a shortage of bread by telling the poor to eat cake. She almost certainly did not say it. The phrase appears in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and was attributed to an unnamed princess. Yet the story survived because it expressed something people believed about the monarchy. It captured the idea that rulers lived in a different world from the people they governed. Bread made that difference visible. A king could discuss policy. A minister could debate taxation. A philosopher could write about liberty. But a hungry family needed a loaf. That pattern did not end with the French Revolution. More than 2 centuries later, bread was still capable of turning economic pressure into political unrest. Egypt provides one of the clearest examples. Bread has an extraordinary cultural importance in Egyptian society. Even the Arabic word aish can mean both bread and life in Egyptian usage. For decades, the Egyptian state subsidized bread to keep it affordable for millions of people. The policy was expensive, complicated, and politically sensitive. When subsidies were threatened, people protested. In 1977, attempts to reduce subsidies contributed to major riots, and the government reversed the measures. Decades later, rising global food prices again placed pressure on Egypt. During the events of 2011, bread was only one part of a much larger political crisis involving unemployment, corruption, police violence, and demands for political change. It would be wrong to say that bread caused the Egyptian revolution, but it would also be wrong to ignore food prices. When a basic necessity becomes more expensive, political frustration becomes easier to feel in everyday life. The same broader pattern appeared across parts of the Middle East and North Africa during periods of food price inflation. In Sudan, cuts to bread subsidies contributed to protests. In other countries, drought, grain prices, war, and disruptions to food supplies intensified existing political tensions. Bread was not always the cause, but it was often the pressure point. And that brings us back to the beginning. 14,000 years ago, a group of hunter-gatherers were grinding wild grain. They did not know they were participating in the history of bread. They were not trying to build cities. They were not designing an economic system. They were not planning the rise of agriculture. They were trying to make food. But that small act connected to something much larger. Grinding grain required tools. Cooking required fire. Making bread required knowledge. Storing grain required organization. Organizing grain required cooperation. Cooperation at larger scales required systems. Those systems helped produce settlements. Settlements became villages. Villages became cities. Cities created governments. Governments needed taxation, administration, records, and supply chains. And suddenly, the humble loaf was connected to the foundations of civilization. There is an even stranger part to the story. Bread was not invented once. Different human societies discovered versions of the same basic technology independently. Wherever people had access to starchy plants, tools for processing them, water and fire, they had the ingredients necessary to discover some form of bread or bread-like food. In the Americas, people developed bread from maize and other plants. In Africa, different grains such as teff became important to distinctive bread traditions. Across Asia, rice and other grains produced their own culinary traditions. Flatbreads appeared in countless cultures. Fermented breads developed in different places and under different conditions. The ingredients changed, the shapes changed, the techniques changed, but the underlying problem remained the same. How do you transform a hard seed into something nutritious, portable, and satisfying? Again and again, humans found an answer, and perhaps that is the deepest lesson in the history of bread. Bread looks ordinary because we have become surrounded by it. We see it packaged behind glass. We see it stacked on shelves. We put it into toasters. We spread butter across it without giving it a second thought. But the loaf in your kitchen is the final stage of a technological story that began before written history. It carries the memory of wild grass. It carries the invention of grinding. It carries the control of fire. It carries the discovery of fermentation. It carries the birth of agriculture. It carries the growth of cities. It carries the bureaucracy of ancient states. It carries the inequalities of medieval society. It carries the machinery of industrialization. And it carries the political lesson learned repeatedly by rulers throughout history. People can tolerate many things, but food is different, because bread is not simply something you want. For much of human history, it was something you needed. That is why bread could function as a ration in ancient Egypt, why Roman governments treated grain supplies as matters of state security, why medieval authorities regulated its weight and price, why French crowds marched on Versailles, why governments subsidized it in modern Egypt, and why disruptions in wheat markets thousands of kilometers away can still affect the price of a loaf today. The modern bread supply chain is vastly more complicated than anything the Natufians could have imagined. Wheat can cross borders. Flour can travel hundreds of kilometers. Industrial bakeries can produce thousands of loaves an hour. A single supermarket may carry bread made using grain grown in one country, milled in another, processed somewhere else, and distributed through a national logistics network. Yet the fundamental relationship has not changed. We still take seeds from a plant. We still grind them. We still add water. We still use heat. And somehow, from those ordinary ingredients, we make one of the most important foods in human history. The next time you tear open a loaf, think about what you are actually holding, not just bread. You are holding the result of thousands of generations of experimentation, a technology older than farming, a food that helped humans settle down, a product that helped feed cities, a commodity that governments learned to fear, a symbol of class, religion, survival, and power. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is that none of the people who made the first bread knew where their discovery would lead. They were not trying to invent civilization. They were just trying to make a handful of wild seeds easier to eat. But sometimes the inventions that change the world do not begin with grand ambitions. Sometimes they begin with a stone, a fire, a little water, and a hungry human being wondering what might happen if they tried something different. That is the real history of bread. And tomorrow morning, when you eat it, you may never look at an ordinary loaf the same way again. And if you enjoyed this journey through the history of bread, don't forget to subscribe to Exhibit A, Everyday Objects. We uncover the hidden stories behind the ordinary things we use every day, objects that seem simple, until you discover the history, people, and events that made them what they are. Subscribe and join us for the next story.